Okay, good evening, students. Welcome back to my lecture on preface to lyrical ballads, which was given in Good evening, student. Welcome back to my lecture on William Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads, which was given in the book in the year 1802. Although this book was published in the year 1798, but it wasn't attached with any preface in the book or in the original, in the first edition. There was few advertisement and all. But within 2 years, you see, Wordsworth was given suggestion by many of his friends, since he was claiming the poetry was new and he has altogether different aspect of poetry from tradition. So what is it all about? That was the question raised by many of his contemporary friends. And to give the whole idea about the creation of poetry and what a role of poet, how poetry is generated, and how a poet should use the diction. So these are the three important points upon which he built up his entire criticism. So when we look back to the critical tradition of England, so after Philip Sidney and John Dryden, William Wordsworth's ideas upon criticism came in this preface are very noteworthy and important to understand the literary tradition in England. Before we go into the preface, we need to go through a little life sketch of Wordsworth. So William Wordsworth was born in the year 1770 and died in the year 1850. We know in his childhood itself, he lost both of his parents, and because of that, you see his early childhood went in some you said difficulties. So he, along with his elder sister Dorothy, had to stay with some relatives, and then very early he started writing poetry, and since he spent his childhood in Lake District, so he developed very close attachment with nature. So obviously, return to nature, the call he has given for the romantic movement, we see that was basically came from his original experiences. So William Wordsworth is a prominent romantic poet, and he is the poet concerned with the human relationship to the nature. So here we see when we go through the poetry written by Wordsworth, we often come across the relationship. He wanted to, unveil the relationship between human and the nature. He published sonnets in the European magazine, thus initiated his poetic career. So it was somewhere in 1780s, early 80s, he published his poem and thus initiated his poetic career. The movement of romantic poetry begins from his book Lyrical Ballad, we have just mentioned, and that book was written in collaboration with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was his friend, whom he met somewhere in 1795. And beside a long poetry, a huge poetry he has created, his semi-autobiographic poem, that is the Prelude, in many volumes, that is very important to understand his poetic growth. And he was made poet laureate in the year 1843, and he was possessing the same position until his death in 1850. Wordsworth's deep love for nature was established early. We see as he spent his early childhood in Lake District, and after you see he lost his parent, his association with nature was increases uh, for the solace or for love. And that could easily be seen from his poetry. The intense lifelong friendship between William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy is there, because you see, Dorothy was quite elder to him, and she was the only close family member to look after him. And this was the reason why you see they were very close and living together. And for a long, we see Wordsworth was having a close association with his sister in case of poetic discussions. So during the days when uh, uh, Coleridge and Wordsworth used to sit together and discuss poetry, so often Dorothy would involve in the discussions and pass on some suggestions to them. In the year 1791, Wordsworth visited France and became enchanted with Republican movement during French Revolution. So you see, 1780s, that decade, was entire decade was the French Revolution, where the people of France, they went against the Louis XIV, and they fought for the freedom. And after that revolution, France became a democratic nation. So the process was the process of becoming a democratic nation, that influences Wordsworth a huge, and the values, especially the liberty, equality, and fraternity. These are the values, very important values. These are the outcome of the movement initiated by the Republicans in France. So democracy basically is the way of life adopted by French. You say people, and that was influences Wordsworth highly. So Wordsworth's passion for democracy, as it is clear in his letter to Bishop of Landorf. So here, that later also called as Apology for French Revolution. So here somehow there were two ways of thinking available in England: one who supported the monarchy, and other who were supported the democracy. So Wordsworth on the other side, who was supporting the democracy, and why the democracy is to be supported. So here, Apology for the French Revolution, he wrote a letter to one bishop, and through which we can get idea about Wordsworth's vision about a democracy. Wordsworth began work on the first extended poetic efforts of his maturity while in France. So while he was still in France, he started writing descriptive sketches. So these descriptive sketches published in the year 1793. So these are the reflections he got from a French Revolution. In 1795, he made Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and this is what a beginning of a very, a very good collaborative venture for Lyrical Ballad, and they became a lifelong friend from that point onwards. So, in the Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798, one of the Wordsworth's most famous poem, Tintern Abbey, was published along with Coleridge, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So the first publication, we see that it doesn't carry either of writer's name and as author of the book. So without writer's name, that book was published. Also, no preface was appended there in the book. The second edition, published in the year 1800, 2 years after the original one, here, Wordsworth listed as the author and included a preface to the poem. So here, Wordsworth appended his only name in this second edition of the book, and he also included a preface, which was go on revising in the further ages. So in the 1802, preface is modified, and that is what we are going to study. In the 1815, there is also one more chapter is added. That is also we are going to see. The brief qualities of poet, which was discussed by Wordsworth in 1815, is a appendix to the preface. So what is preface that we have to understand? You know? So preface is somehow we see sometimes in any book. You just go through any book, and then there is a preface. So it gives you the idea as to how writer has generated this particular aspect of book. So how he gather theme, and what are his influences, and what is he going to do, or what is he going to discuss in the entire book. So this is what the aspect one writer uses in the preface. So the preface of 1802 is a long account of nature, qualification, and function of a poet, the demonstration of his superiority over the man of science, and the examination of nature of poetic pleasure. So here you see romantics in the modern age writers, they, I mean, condemn, or they see, I mean, the fault with romantic poetry, because they created author god like concept. So you see what an author is to be, and how a poetry is generated out of tranquility. This is what the basic points around which preface is made. There are several other points are there, like diction is discussed, and Wordsworth is very elaborately discussed about the rustic language, or language of simple life, how it is to be adopted in poetry. So he defended rustic language and simple language heavily in this document. To this edition, Wordsworth added appendix on poetic diction, devoted to a consideration of poetic diction and its history. So after the main preface, there is one appendix, and in that appendix, he discussed about poetic diction. Because you see, Wordsworth has adopted a very different kind of diction, and he claimed that it is came from a simple language and simple structure of rustic people. The preface was constantly revised in the following volumes, as I have mentioned just. The preface was added since his poems were of new kind, both in themes and style. So there was the urgency was there with Wordsworth to introduce his poem along with his own ideas. So here he made humble submissions. You know, so it is how the prefaces begin. Several of my friends are anxious for the success of these poems, from the belief that if the views with which they were composed were indeed realized, a class of poetry would be produced. So here you see, Wordsworth also acknowledges that the poems included in the lyrical ballads had a success, and because of that, uh, since the poems were new, having new, structure, having new, you say, clothes, because of that, they were well received by the audiences, readers. And not unimportant in the multiplicity, in the quality of its moral relations, and on this account, they have advised me to prefix a systematic defense of theory upon which the poems were written. So here you see many readers of Wordsworth, or many readers of lyrical ballad, they felt the claim made by Wordsworth, the poems were new. So in what sense these poems were new? And Wordsworth has to come out with the idea he has given. So they requested him, or they advised him to give a preface to these lyrical ballads. So what a theory he is talking about, or what a theory he has devised while presenting his poems in this volume. So here he made such humble submissions. So the defense of his theory: poetry must be written in a selection of a real language of men in a state of emotional excitement. So you see, in those days, writers were very sophisticated kind of writers from a particular, you say, state of status, and because of that, you see, sophisticated, you say, a group of men or readers, they only were the follower of those writers. So in this way, you see that language used by these high society of writers. So they are quite away from the a normal or a rural language or language of majority of people. Although we can't say that they were speaking different English in different parts. That is not the case. But here, the sophistication of language is obviously there with the writers, those who were writing during that period. But Wordsworth found a problem with that because with this, they brings a limitation to literature because the common folk, they are away from philosophies, they are away from high intellect. And this is the reason why they may not understand the poetry of high class society writers. And this was the reason why his idea is to make his poem very simplified and he must use language, words, vocabulary, and structure from a common, simple life. Now, here he gives some reason as to why he added the preface. Number one, it is foolish to win people appreciation through reasoning. Now, here, reasoning he could give. You know, there are a number of reason or multiple reason he can give uh, in support of his poem. But he say it is foolish. Poet must trust the sense of readers. So here, writers' stand must be that he should sense the reader's understanding, the reader's expectation. Appreciation will come naturally if poems are worthy. So if poems are really worthy, if they liked by reader, so obviously appreciation will came from them. But if poetry is difficult, if they carry some difficult theme and it is beyond the understanding of the common man, so obviously common man wouldn't give his or her appreciation to these poems. So the preface may not be adequate defense to Wordsworth poetry. So basically, this preface is not adequate defense of Wordsworth poetry, but here he is making humble submissions about poetry and his idea as to what a poetry is to be, how it is to be generated, or how it generates, in what status of mind it take birth, and what kind of a language a writer is to follow, and what a writer should be or what a poet should be. Qualification of poet he is talking about, and qualification of a critic he is talking about. So these are the 4 points are there. The nature of preface is simply an introduction to the poems and not the systematic defense. So the preface, the nature of this preface is simply an introduction to the poem. He simply want to introduce his poem, and this is not a systematic defense. He is not going to defend each of his poetry, how they are different from the previous tradition. No, he is not going to talk on that. But he is talk on that, the process of creativity. Since poems are different, he warns reader that conventional pleasure may not be expected from the poems. So conventional pleasure, obviously, that aesthetics set during that period that was different than the poems are based upon in this lyrical ballad. So Wordsworth's aim is to choose incidents and situation from the common life because he want to enhance or he want to increase the number of readership. It is not to be restricted within a few, I mean, reading circle, but he wanted to widen his circle, and in that case, he, any local or any, a simple man, a rustic, or from any rural background, mean they should find themselves within the literature. Until unless they find their representation, they may not be attracted toward the literature. This is what the basic point. I mean, when we talk about Shakespeare, why Shakespeare became successful, blockbuster, it is because each and every one of us from different society, from different status, we can find our representation through the drama. And this is what the basic clue Wordsworth is discussing over here. The reason for choosing aspect of rustic life. Okay, now here he's giving why he is choosing the rustic aspect of life, because they should see their reflection into the poems. The feeling are freely and frankly expressed. So you see, in rustic life, people do express very simply. They don't have any complexity in their life to express, like in very poetic way, in a very tragic way, in a philosophic way, to express their suffering and sympathies. No, This is not the idea. Simple mean uses their simple language, and that is to be the real expression without any polishing. So feelings are simple, so are expressed more accurately and forcefully. So there is no reason to make any sophisticated structure to express the idea of feeling. Feeling are simple, out of simple life, and they are to be adorned with a very simple language. The manners of rustic lives are not sophisticated. Okay, so now here Wordsworth directly went into comparison between the two social classes, one which is sophisticated and other which is a lower one, a very simple one. So here rustic life is not sophisticated. They choose very simple word to express their, we say, express their ideas, express their emotions. In rustic life, human passions are connected with grand and noble object of nature. So you see, he is defending the rustic life, which is connected with a grand and noble object of nature, because the language and the expression of rustics is highly associated with the nature, because they live in the lap of nature, and therefore their ideas and their coloring of language is entirely influenced of the nature and their interaction with the nature. So why Wordsworth is using the language of rustic? Because the best object of nature from which the best part of language is derived. So here, this is what a very important clue he is giving us. The best object of nature from which the best part of language is derived. And this reason why he was choosing the language of rustics. Second, due to low status in society, they are less under influence of vanity, so be able to convey feeling and emotion simply. So you see, because of their simplicity, their simple life, it's quite away from high influencing, high status society. And this was the reason why their feeling and emotions are very simply, and they are very easy to convey. Now, while talking about emotions, Wordsworth maintained all the poems included in the volume has a worthy of purpose, that is enlightening the reader and purifying their emotions. So you see, again, I'll take you back to Aristotle. So when Aristotle is talking about the tragedy, concept of tragedy, six element of tragedy, so he introduces the last element of sixth element, that is the pity and fear. So pity and fear is nothing but the purgation or the purification of the mind. Now, who is going to purify? Is it writer or the characters? No, they are not. The purification of the mind of readers, audiences. So obviously, this emotion is related to the reader. So here, after Aristotle, we see Wordsworth is also think of the reader. He is also thinking of purification of the emotion of readers. So they are the spontaneous overflow of passion modified with thoughts. So here the spontaneity is there, not no any artificiality, no any making of mood or searching of mood. No, it's very spontaneous overflow of passion comes out of language. So whenever emotion is overburdened on a simple life, a simple man, he started simply expressing his ideas. So poems are also supposed to express the simple way. The poem's feelings are important than action and situation. So here, what action is required or a situation is there. So here, Wordsworth is giving emphasis to the feelings, emotions. Now, in case of poetic diction, Wordsworth avoided the various conventional devices of contemporary poetic diction. So contemporary poetic diction is highly sophisticated, highly metrical composition. Okay, different kinds of rhyming scheme, and then different way of metrical composition was adopted. So obviously, this is artificial way of creating poetry. But here, Wordsworth wanted a free flow of languages to be used in metrical composition, and that could be achieved only when a writer is adopting a simple language. So here, Wordsworth selected natural themes and thereof natural language. So the themes in poems should be from the rural life, from the simple life. Now, there was a tradition when writers would go into Bible, mythology, and history to fetch the themes. Okay, and in the previous lecture, we have seen how Neander, condemns the, classic writers for fetching themes of lot from mythology and from history. And this is the reason why he found the classic literature is a boredom. You know? So here we see Wordsworth is also thinking of the same, and here he wanted themes are to be adopted from simple language. So he varied language according to the character adopted. He uses language more sensibly and correctly. So he maintained, I'll go further. I do not doubt that it may be safely affirmed that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. So here, the very humble submission of writer is this, that there shouldn't be any difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. You know? So it is to be simple, it is to be lifelike, it is to be taken directly from people's speech like that. So we are fond of tracing the resemblance between poetry and painting, and accordingly we call them sisters. Now you see, according to writer, Wordsworth, he is now comparing poetry with painting. Now you see, when we go back to Plato and Aristotle, so Aristotle equates or find literature is close to, poetry is close to the music. And here you see, Wordsworth is comparing poetry with the painting. So meter is not essential in poetry, but it is additional source of pleasure. So it is to be used. So in case of metrical composition, use of metrical composition, he is affirmative. So he says ki, use of meter gives additional pleasure. So it is desirable. So here a writer may or may not be using the meter. So here it is on the mercy of writer, on the liberty is given to him. So he may like, he can use meter, or if it is not required, he may not use it. You know? So when poet speaks through the characters, the language used must be appropriate to the character and situation. So which character he is speaking, that is important. So accordingly, the language should vary. You know? So if a character is from simple life and language is used from a high society, so in this way, a mismatch will be created and the poetry will not give any effect or influence to the reader. So this was the reason why there should be a justice to the language and the character, identified. The ornate diction may shock the reader, so it is out of place. So ornate language, language of ornament, may shock the reader. You know? Because here the character is very simple, and the incidences are taken from the common life, but language is used ornamental. So in that case, reader may get confused of. A simpler diction should be used for the less elevated emotions. So you see, when emotions are there, so emotion could become artificial with a complicated diction. Therefore, a diction is to be simple so that it is justified with the elevated emotions. Passion is primary thing. If feelings are noble, expression becomes elevated automatically. So here intention is very important. The intention of writer should be noble, and then poetry becomes elevated automatically. So this is a very close connection between passion of a writer, his intention, and his, outcome of his poetry. So here he maintained, taking up subject, then upon general grounds, I ask what is meant by the word poet. Now here, after maintaining or after discussing the subject matter of the poetry, general ground for poetry, now he is discussing what is a poet. Poet kya hai? What is a poet? To whom does he address himself? And what language is to be expected from him? So here, what a poet is, the concept of poet is given by Wordsworth here. So a poet is essentially a man speaking to man. So here, very importantly, the creation of literature is for whom? So, or particularly for which class he is writing to? Is it for all or is it for a particular class? So, when the tradition was there, when a certain group of writers or reader are to be tapped or are to be influenced, or this is what meant for them. So, in that case, a large number of readers are cut away from the writer's writing, and this is the reason why now here Wordsworth is asking a question. Okay, now what is question? For whom the poetry is written to? Okay, so here while maintaining this, he is simply asking a question. Sorry, he is simply maintaining a statement. A poet is essentially a man speaking to men. You know, he is communicating with men. That is what important. A poet is a function of poetry. A poet writes not for his pleasure alone, but for pleasure of his reader. Now, many times we see writer, they are elated with certain subject matter. And then with that idea of elated mind, they started writing poetry. But here, Wordsworth is now altering this thought and he says, the pleasure of reader is important. You know, what he find pleasure in, it may not give pleasure to the reader. This is what the problem. Okay. And while poets are writing poetry, they should keep in mind the reader's pleasure. If they are getting pleasure in the poetry he is creating. A poet differs from an ordinary man, not in nature, but in degree. So you see, Wordsworth put everyone else on a common ground. So poet is not a superhuman being, he is not a divine one, but there is a difference of degree only. He just be able to pursue the emotion. He is able to express the emotion. That's it. The poet has greater or more lively sensibility. So here Wordsworth maintained that he is greater and more lively sensibly. Greater power of imagination he possesses, greater knowledge of human nature, you know, and more comprehensive soul to sympathize and feel others. So he must be able to sympathize other and feel other, because until and unless he feel other, he may not be able to portray character in his poetry, because all the time he is not going to talk about himself, but he is going to talk about people around him. And until and unless writer is feeling them, writer is understanding them, sympathize with them, he may not be able to represent them. So writer must have a greater gist for life, and then he must have a greater power of emotion. So writer himself must have possess this quality of greater power of emotion, and then only he'll be able to, express the emotion of the character he is portraying. The poet communicates personally felt emotion which he has not experienced directly, hence the language may be mechanical. So here, if there is no feeling, there is no emotion in writer while portraying a character, so in that case, his language becomes mechanical or artificial. You know? So emotion and feelings are very important to make the language lively. He should try to achieve the identification with his characters to make his language more lively. So here, who is the character? In what kind of association he established with the character is important. Until and unless this association has been established, writer is unable to make his language lively for poetic presentation. Now, what a poetic pleasure is. Now here, in the beginning itself, Wordsworth unveiled the very important point that the poetic pleasure is important, and then reader's pleasure is also important. So what a poetic pleasure is? So he maintained, poet writes under one restrictions only, namely that of the necessity of giving immediate pleasure to human being possessed of that information which may be expected from him, not as a lawyer, a physician, a mariner, an astronomer, or a natural philosopher, but as a man. So a human being experience, get experience, and he want to share experience, not as all these characters. Okay, he don't want to express those ideas, express his emotion, as a doctor, mariner, or astronomer, but as a human being. So that human being appeals to other, because all these are the skilled mean they are representing a particular class, may not be able to influence or may not be able to give pleasure to the common man. And this is the reason why in every such character there should be a common person alive, and that is to be created by the writer. So in this way, the concept of poetic pleasure for Wordsworth is, narrating or expressing his idea as a common man. Then poetic pleasure is not mere idle amusement, but it is much higher and nobler. So it's not only to give pleasure to reader, it's not only business of pleasure making, but it is something higher and nobler. Poetic truth is higher than truth of history and philosophy. So here you see Aristotle upheld poetry above history and philosophy, and so also Wordsworth also upheld poetry is high or above of history and philosophy. Now, philosophy deals with the abstract truth, and that abstract truth you may understand or may not understand, because it is again, deal with your understanding, level of understanding. So, a common man may not be able to understand those philosophical ideas. Therefore, these are abstract idea cannot be felt. History deals with a particular illustration, but poetry gives us universal truth and illustration from the example. So in this way, poetic truth is a universal truth, or poetry gives us universal truth and illustration from the example of a common life. So poetry aims at truth to nature, which could only be modified for pleasure. So here poetry is a kind of a transformation, is kind of a tool at the hand of a writer, where he, seek truth to nature, and then it is modified for the pleasure. Now here poetry gives pleasure because, now what are the reason? It imitates nature well. Why poetry gives pleasure? Because it imitates nature well. Then it increases our knowledge and primary understanding of human nature. It talks about the basic human nature. Poetry talks about our emotion. It talks about our feelings. So this is very basic to each and every human being, wherever you go and find everywhere in the world. It arouses our sympathy, which brings satisfaction. Okay, so it arouses sympathy. Now you see, poetry, civilizes us. That was the idea Sydney has given us. So similarly, sympathy, that is the essential experience given by poetry. Okay, and that brings satisfaction to the reader as well as writer. It makes us perceive the essential identity of a man and a nature. Now here, this identification is very important as a writer and as a person whom to this poetry is communicated. Since truth of science is particular and individual, poetry is superior to science because poetic truth is universal. So here, not only poetry is above the history and philosophy, but it is above the science as well. Why? Because because poetic truth is universal, and science, the truth of science may be timed, because science is always changing. The technology we invent today, it becomes obsolete in the future, it becomes outdated in future, but the poetic truth is not outdated. So what human nature is there thousands of years ago, what approach we have to the other human being and nature, it is same today with us. So here, a poet talks about the truth, the nature of human being, and it is very universal to all. The poet goes down to the soul of things. So the truth he realizes is the coloring of the imagination and emotion. So here, you see, poet went into the mind of readers, or soul of things. And truth he realizes is the coloring of imagination and emotion. So here you see modern science sent some devices into your stomach, into your intestine, into every in the body inside, and they try to search out. But here you see, a poet did not go into someone's body like that. but he enters in someone's mind and explore his emotion, explores his feeling. Okay, so in this way, poetry is the breadth and final spirit of all knowledge. In this way, the appeal of scientific is to intellect. So scientific appeal is to intellectuals only, whereas poet is here and soul of his reader. So here the difference between science and a poet is this: science is limited to the intellectual one, but poetry influences and give pleasure to all. When a poet uses ornamental and stylistic devices, the poet has a low opinion of his own calling. Now, very importantly, he should realize, a poet should realize. So whenever he is using ornamental and stylistic device, means he don't have much to say. है ना? This is the reason why he is giving these elaborated or ornamental words. So if a writer has many things to share, if he has many ideas to, share, in that case, he doesn't require any ornamental language. That is why he seek to win appreciation by artificial means. So when person don't have original ideas, don't have bulk to express, so he seek solace or he seek help from ornamental language. Now here, after this, we are now shifting on to the ideas on meter. So what is the idea of meter of Wordsworth? So meter is something regular and uniform, while poetic diction is arbitrary and capricious. So meter is very regularly used. A line is adopted in the poem, the composition of line in a particular sequence. That is what a meter. Okay, but here diction is arbitrary. The rules for meter is fixed, but poetic diction has no such rule. So this is what the difference we have to understand. Use of meter for numerous regions. Now here, Wordsworth give reason. Okay, why the metrical composition is to be used. Meter is additional source of pleasure. Very first he, mentioned that it gives you additional pleasure. By using meter, poet simply follows the tradition because here he is the part and parcel of the tradition. He is not going away from that tradition because this poetry of lyrical ballad, although they are new, but they are not away from the tradition. That is what very important point he is making over here. So meter has restraining and tempering effect on flow of emotion and passion. Okay, so meter has a restraining and tempering effect on flow of emotion and passion. So there is a danger of losing, emotion and passion. So therefore, writer is to be very careful while using meter. So the original emotion and feeling intensity of both should not lose. The use of meter gives the perception of similarity in dissimilarity, always gives pleasure. So here when a writer uses a meter, so it gives the perception of similarity in dissimilarity. So while in the metrical composition, a writer created some metaphor, simile, very figure of speech he uses, and in this way he gives pleasure. So meter gives pleasure as it softens and tempers the painful emotions and imparts grace and dignity to the higher emotion. Okay, so here writer is now handling some tempers the painful emotions. Now some of the Wordsworth poems you see they have very high and painful emotions, and on the other hand it imparts grace and dignity to the higher emotions. Meter gives us an idea of skills with which the poet has overcome difficulties, and this is a source of pleasure. So here, writer is required a skill. He should be master of metrical composition. In that case, only his metrical composition becomes natural. It leaves artificiality out of it. And when a skilled writer is using meter, so he is overcoming all kind of difficulties and becomes a source of pleasure. Now here, towards the end part of the preface, here writer talks about, Wordsworth talks about the poetic process. A very famous quote of this preface is here. He says, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling. So here he is talking about the creation, in which status of mind poetry generates. So here he talks about spontaneity and overflow of powerful feeling. Okay, so here when feelings are powerful, overflowing powerfully and spontaneously, it takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Okay, so emotion is recollected in tranquility. The emotion is contemplated till by a species of reaction, the tranquility gradually disappear, and an emotion kindred to that which are before the subject of contemplation is gradually produced, and does itself actually exist in the mind. So here you see tranquility is a short-lived, you say, a status of mind. And within that fraction of time or within that fraction of moment, writer recollected emotion. Okay, and then gradually that status, I mean that level of tranquility is disappearing. But what remains is the contemplations of the subject. In this mood, successful composition generally begins. So, so the tranquility is the status of mind where writer is went into, and where from he get the overflow of powerful feeling, and poetry is spontaneously got from this process. Now here writer has gives us four important stages of poetic composition. Now, first stage is observation. So here a poet should be a good observer because he is going to represent a simple and rustic life. So his observations are very important. Then recollection. Recollection is there for thought, feeling, emotion, and then the natural setup. And then contemplation. Now contemplation is a meditation. His writer's self-thinking process. And then fourth is imaginative excitement of emotion. Because here writer is giving words to those thoughts which are recollected in tranquility. So here imagination is at the high level, which was treating with excitement of emotion. So here these are the four stages from which poetry has been generated. So such process of creativity gives pleasure to poet. And when poet wants to communicate his own joy to his reader, meter helps him in this regard. So here you see, such is the process gives pleasure to poet. Okay, now it's not only reader is going to enjoy, but basically writer is also enjoyed himself. So when writer is enjoying himself, obviously his audience and reader will be able to pursue that excitement. But here in this business, meter helps him in this regard. The poet may be criticized for his choice of sinful themes. There is obvious because the poetry and its tradition has already been set. Now, Wordsworth is taking people away from that tradition, and this was the reason why this simple choice of language may be criticized of. But his writing is not to please the critics. He should be convinced that he is the right. Now, here the limitation is to be set. Now, writer should set his limitation for whom he is writing poetry to, whether it is pleasing the critics or whether he is writing his poetry for common man. So obviously, when poetry is not mean to a common critic, so obviously then critic is nothing to do in this business. So he is not he should not afraid of any critic. The real thing in poetry is feeling and language. So here repeatedly writer is maintaining this idea. So real thing in poetry is feeling and language. Worthy sentiments ennobles the language. Readers should judge the poet on the basis of their feelings and not on the critics. So here a reader should judge the poet on the basis of their feeling. Now here there was a tradition when critic is a mediator and he would help reader understand poetry. But here readers should not be diverted of critics. He should judge poet on the basis of feeling expressed in the poem. Though the poetry in lyrical ballad is new, but it is pleases the people. है ना? So in the beginning itself, we got clue that the poem appeared in lyrical ballad. They were highly appreciated and well received by the audience. So obviously, people got pleasure out of it. So it would result in production of pure poetry capable of giving higher pleasure. So obviously, the pure intention of pure poetry has a capacity to give pleasure at a higher level. Now, after preface in the year 1804, a writer has given one appendix to the main preface, that is called a diction. But diction we already have discussed. And then there is one more supplementary is given to the preface attached in the year 1850. And now here this preface talks about the critic. A competent and reliable critics are rare. Now here he says the critics are biased in those days. So a reliable and impartial critic is rare, according to Wordsworth. Now care and worries drives out of the test of poetry. Okay, now care and worries drives out the test of poetry. That is very important. No time to poetry due to pursuit of business and power. Now you see, people are not into poetry because they are busy in their business and power. And poetry is read as an escape from the life of realities. Now people, those are in difficulties or they are into some problems, they seek, some escape into the literature. Competent critics can come only through serious student of poetry. So critic is not to be artificial, meant for his livelihood. So he must be a student of poetry. He must be able to understand poetry, poets, themes properly, and then unbiased. He should give his appreciation. The young are immature so that they cannot be trustworthy critics. So there are critics from different age groups. So young critics are not trustworthy because they are not mature. They are yet to be good student of poetry. So mature men are expected to Wordsworth to give their ideas on poetry and judgment to the poetry, because at that level they could be impartial. An artificial poetic tradition, personal and literary prejudices are the obstacle to the sound criticism. So now you see, if a criticism is sound or unbiased, so in that case there are certain hurdles. So artificial poetic tradition, if a critic is following, so obviously he is not going to give a good judgment. If it is personal and literary prejudices, like some critics have personal prejudices, personal rivalry to writer, and in that case there is a possibility that his criticism may come out of that prejudice. Like you see, sometimes some good movies are there, but then it doesn't carry stars in the, you say, critics, you say, mentioned in the newspaper. Now it came out of, you say, the prejudices. Yeah. Sometimes some good movie fell flat. It's because of the prejudices of, you say, even reader and audiences. Failure to realize differences between poetry and religion results in much misunderstanding. Now here, this is very important. Failure to realize differences. So here, poetry and religion, these are the two different areas, different ideas. So we should be able to differentiate religion from poetry. So if you are seeking religion into poetry, then obviously poetry will fall flat. है ना? Because poetry is altogether a different genre. It's not going to give you the ethics and morality lessons. So it is the mere experiences of people. It is emotion and feeling they are expressed through the poetry. So obviously poetry is to be differentiated from the religion. Then passion and imagination are the key point for the poetry. Okay, so when critic is going into poem, so he should look into the passion of poetry and imagination of writer. Now here, Wordsworth gives some ideal critic and its qualifications. Number one, he must be both poetic and philosophical. Okay, so an ideal critic should be poetic, means he must be poet of himself, है ना, of high level. Then only he'll be able to criticize. And then he should have philosophical background. His affections must be free. And he should not have any prejudices to a certain writer upon which he is building his criticism. Must be of clear understanding and dispassionate judgment. So here, impartial judgment is expected from a critic, and therefore, this critic must have a clear understanding. His vision must not be clouded by his literary, personal, and religious prejudices. So there is a possibility that a critic may be influenced of his own literary choices, personal grudges for writer, and religious prejudices. So these are the very important hurdles came into way of impartial criticism. And then critics' sensibilities must trained by continuous study of poetry. So it's not, I mean, here and there he is reading some poem, picking some poem, and then he is writing criticism all. So over the period of time, he must develop maturity in the criticism. The competent and reliable critics are found rare in the history of English literature. Very important statement he made. Now, impartiality is important. Now, it was a time when critic became the maker and unmaker of the poet's career. And then there was a time when, during Romantics and Victorian period, some writers, they would, scared of critics because critics now became God. So earlier, Wordsworth is talking about creative God, but later on, critic God is also developed, and they are now checking the poets. The poet must create the test by which he is to be enjoyed and appreciated. So the poet must create the test by which he is to be enjoyed and appreciated. Now here, Wordsworth is talking about a style. A poet has to devise or he has to identify his own style, and it is to be, enjoyed by readers and appreciated for that. Now, various ways of creating poetic tests. Now, here, Wordsworth is making some points on which a creative poetic test can be built. Number one, the poet must overcome the prejudices, immaturity, and apathy of his readers. So here, reader is also, the poet is also must be away from any prejudices, immaturity, and apathy of his reader. है ना? So he should not, blame reader for his mismanagement. So he should consider the reader. He must break the bond of custom and tradition. So it's not like that he is writing in a tradition and he has to follow it. So in creativity, he has to break that bond and he has to create his own style. He must humanize his reader. Very importantly, democratic ideas, it was adopted by Wordsworth, and he says he poet must humanize his reader. Now, while he is making this statement, he simply intends that readers should be able to feel and feel emotion of writer, and as a common man. He must make them realize the worth of people in human walks of life. So here readers should sympathize with the character, because through poetry only readers can understand the sympathy. The reader can understand ideas like love, compassion, and the cooperation, social living like that. So poet is the one who creates bonding amongst the readers. The test, according to Wordsworth, is an active and cooperative efforts of intellect, and this alone can lead to a real appreciation and enjoyment. So here, test, according to the Wordsworth, is an active and cooperative effort. So here, test is the active and cooperative effort of the intellect. So it is again requires some efforts. Now, poet requires some time to become mature in this art. He has to spend lots of time to develop his intelligent. Because again, it's a matter of intelligence to create a metrical composition and adopting simple ideas, simple themes, and simple language for his metrical composition. Taste is an energy and a poet of intellect which makes the reader cooperate with the poet. Now, when we expect a reader to cooperate us, so in that case, the energy and the poet's intellect are to be matched. You know, they are to be matched. A great poet himself has passion and must be able to impart this passion to the reader. Now, what he conceives in his mind, it is to be translated in the poetry. So, what he conceives something, and if we translate it halfway, or partially. So, in that case, that pleasure and that whole image won't be conveyed to the reader. The pathos is very complex and intricate emotion. It could be communicated through language. So pathos are very important emotion according to the writer, and it is to be communicated through the language. A great poet can shape the language, but he must be able to teach his reader to appreciate what is new and original. Now here, in the beginning itself, writer made a very important statement that he must humanize the reader. So in that case, he must be able to train his reader to appreciate. You know? So when writer is bringing out or coming out with good poetry, so here reader must be able to appreciate it. So in that case, so training also is important of reader, and that is also to be given by the writer himself. In the conclusion, Wordsworth does not hope for immediate recognition and popularity. So, if a writer is there and he is writing poetry, so he should not expect he is going to be famous within a night. You know, so Rome wasn't built in a night. So, in this way, he should wait patiently for his popularity. But it does not mean that he has no respect for people. So here there should be a respect. A people should respect writer and poet should respect people. This is the vice versa. He differentiates people from the reading public. Now here Wordsworth is differentiating people from the reading public. So reading public is one group and people is a different. So according to reading public comprise a select group. So when writer is talking about a reader group, it is a selected people. Wordsworth doesn't care about prejudices from this group. A certain intellectual group, which is a reader group, and if they are criticizing, so Wordsworth is disregard them. The people represents embodied spirit of knowledge. The rest of the people, large, people, okay, large number of people, they embody the spirit of knowledge. And poet has full faith in their judgment because common man, when they find their reflection, they get happiness, they get pleasure out of it. So obviously, writer is very confident about his communication with the or communion with the common folk, and this is the reason why he is very sure about the appreciation from these people. He offers his poem to them. So here Wordsworth is offering his entire body of poems to these common people and not to a particular a group of readers. So in this way he distinguishes readers, a readers group and people. Okay, so in this way we come to the conclusion of this Wordsworth preface. So preface has two parts we have studied today: the preface of 1802, and then a supplementary to the preface which was appended in the year 1815. Okay, so with this I am concluding my lecture now. In the next lecture we will discuss literary biographia, selected chapters given for our study. uh, if you have any question and query, you can keep posting me. I'll be answering them through WhatsApp chat. If you people want live session, so we can have morning live session from Monday onward. So for that, you have to be very, particular. You have to be you have to communicate your questions in the WhatsApp. So you should respond and acknowledge my messages in the WhatsApp so that I'll be able to organize live classes and live interaction for these discussions I am making through these video tutorials. So thank you for now. Tomorrow I'll come with Coleridge's biography literature. Okay, so thank you. Bye.